This program deals with devil worship and satanic beliefs. It contains explicit scenes and descriptions of violent crimes and rituals.
Americans are asking, who attacked our country?
You have declared a subliminal jihad against the United States. Can you tell us why?
Everything pertaining to what's happening has never come to the surface. The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives.
And night fell on a different world.
And Iblis is thinking, I should be getting this position, not Adam, and this guy is created from dirt.
And how does the army feel about you being head of the Temple of Set?
And the conspiracy theorists can say what they will, but
I want you to give me power over Adam. And I want you to give me soldiers and minions and all of these things.
The people that had so much to gain and had such a material motive for putting me in a position I'm in will never let the true facts come above board to the world.
And I want you to be able to give me the ability to whisper into the hearts of mankind.
And who was the grotto leader?
Don't remember his name.
You don't remember the name of a person who involved you in murder?
now these people are in very high positions, Jack.
Yes.
Ooh, welcome back to Subliminal Jihad, episode 247. I'm your co-host, Dimitri.
I'm Khalid.
And today, we have a fun little deep dive for all of you. One that's probably been on the list for a while, definitely been in the back of my mind since we started SJ, but, historical events have brought things to a head, and I think it has ripened in relevance enough that I think we have to tackle a couple different topics today. But I guess the main watchword...
Was this one that we had on there for a long time?
I think I had written it down at some point on our big list.
Yeah, I really didn't know too much about this. Like, when you first mentioned it to me, I was like, are you talking about Elon and Sam Altman? And then, I looked a bit more into it. There are a lot of parallels, but I wasn't super familiar with this. I actually, I was just saying, I was into Veblen a little bit, when I was in undergrad, the theory of the leisure class, but I didn't associate him with all this. It was kind of interesting to read about.
There's some interesting intellectual history to get into today, and it's all going to be circling around the watchword technocracy, right? And I think this is a word that every now and then we like to unpack a term, or also trace its historical evolution and what it means and evokes to people. And we've done it with parapolitics pretty exhaustively.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And we've also traced the philosophical lineage of things that you could actually people might call technocratic. For example, our cybernetics episodes with past and upcoming guest Jay, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where we talked about Norbert Wiener and all this other stuff.
Yeah, definitely there's a lot of overlap with cybernetic governmental and political thought, or the application of cybernetic ideas to politics, is very much resonates with some of the stuff in the early technocracy movement.
We even you could say we kind of touched on it tangentially in our Molly Maguire episodes when we were reading about Franklin Gowen, president of the Reading Railroad, and his, grandiloquent philosophies of business in the late 1800s. And I think his biographer, who was writing in the 1940s, sort of pointed out that, he might have been a little crazy, but he was kind of ahead of his time in terms of predicting and demanding the kind of rationalization of economic activity and business into really, I think what he would call a more rational and kind of balanced system where everybody wins and things like that. And some of these things would even be, first they would be seized upon by the man that kicked him out of the business, J.P. Morgan. And we talked about in the history of the Great American Fortunes, the Morganization phenomenon of the very late 1800s, the turn of the century, where Morgan just started buying up all these different industries and created these kind of vertically integrated, business structures and cartels effectively to sort of fix and stabilize prices and all these other things. And you could see through that in the early 20th century, even though it was a time of, it was sort of the the decadent peak of the robber baron Gilded Age era. At the same time, it seemed like all the trends were moving towards more of a like mechanized rationalization of economic activity, away from like the brutal laissez-faire chaos of like the early 1800s, and things would kind of congeal together and eventually reach a level of like complexity that you needed some kind of higher coordination. Then, of course, like a little bit later in the the early 20th century, you have the Bolshevik Revolution, you have the Soviet Union, and the idea of like central economic planning that starts to take off in the 1920s.
Yeah.
And then, we're off to the races in terms of, the rest of the 20th century and this big complicated question of how to like rationally manage like an economic system. And today, it's a contested question, right? In a lot of different ways.
We have like AI coming up with our tariff schedule and all this stuff. I mean, a lot of this like resonates a lot with like the rise of AI and the idea of like using these language models to come up with like government or like, I guess, in like cybernetic solutions, like means of social control. And like really the language of like, I feel like we're putting the cart before the horse a little bit, or like burying the lead. Like, but looking at like what was called the technocracy movement, around like the interwar period, and then like after World War II as well, their ideas really do revolve around like the idea of control in a big way. Like I read this long screed by this guy who was very influential in that movement, who was a geologist. What was his name? Let me find it here. It was M. King Hubbard. It seemed like he like kind of ghost wrote or like, without attribution, like a lot of like technocracy movement study materials and stuff. And he like talked about like Pavlov at length and like how to condition people socially. Like it really, a lot of it has to do with it's very like cybernetic, even though they don't use that term. So
right.
Like,
yeah, exactly. And so today, to state the lead, we're going to be talking about, even though that term technocracy has been expanded to mean, it can connote a lot of different things, but more often today, I feel like in our lifetimes, maybe it's a little different in the last like 5 to 10 years, but for a lot of our lifetimes, like I would associate that with like the Clinton administration. These guys were technocrats, like they were just all about smart solutions and looking at the data and like not, getting and not being too, letting emotions or politics, politricks, kind of guide their decisions, but rather look at rational. It's very neoliberal, right? You think of like a neoliberal bureaucrat.
Yeah,
kind of
actually,
as like,
I think of
technocrat.
Obama like first and foremost. Like when someone says like, who's like an example of a technocratic like
I guess you're right.
politician. So there's like a little like a lowercase t technocrat, which is just basically someone who like values like technical expertise, like broadly construed, and like governs through like the application of like technical expertise and the consultation of it, and like values like highly trained technical experts, right? Calling on like the best people in whatever field to solve the problems that emerge in that domain, and like running the data. It's kind of like wonkishness is like this
wonkishness
sort of
is
broad
it's a
sense
synonym.
of technocrat.
Like Ezra Klein, who I mean, in a way, we can kind of riff on this later, but he's been running around with his theory of like an abundant society.
I thought of him too, because they use the term abundance like a lot.
Oh yeah.
And it really it reminded me of like this whole idea of abundance. There's a lot of resonances with today, and yet like I feel like this whole movement doesn't come up so much. You don't really hear about it, even though like, as I'm sure we're going to talk about, like there are like some actual like very like material like links to some like prominent people today, like even though like the actual like family members of people who are so prominent in our political landscape in the present.
Sins of the father does has nothing to do. No, like so shut up. Like I'm getting triggered. No, I'm just kidding.
Not to indict anyone.
No,
like,
he's not his grandfather. You just can't. He's a cool guy. He's a cool engineer. Like he just okay. So to bury lead, sorry about that. We are talking about capital T, Technocracy Incorporated, a group, like you said, from the interwar period. And yeah, we should say up front, like the reason I think I certainly got interested and first heard about this is becoming it's becoming more well known. The mainstream media, now that the Doge captain of government is doing what he's doing, and he's not like a heckin' liberal, like climate change defeating Tony Stark guy anymore. You're seeing more articles about this. And I would put this, firmly in like, this is there's a lot of dracularity with this, that a prominent figure in the Technocracy Incorporated movement, in fact, its head in Canada in the late 1930s and early 1940s, was a man named Joshua Haldeman, who happens to be the maternal grandfather of Elon Musk. So, then when we think about Elon Musk and his entire life, and maybe it being a representation of, both lowercase t technocracy, but also maybe this group his grandfather was deeply involved in, well, it makes one want to investigate and kind of unpack it. But I think, there's a complicated, obviously, I guess you could jump to like the Technocracy Inc. is like taking over the world, folks, which is not exactly the case. This group sort of fell off in terms of its like popularity. It did have a moment where it was popular in the 30s, but it sort of limped along as like a marginal organization under its founder and leader, Howard Scott, until he died in 1970. And there's a few of his followers have kind of like branched off into their own kind of wacky little utopian things, but you can't, on the one hand, you can't really trace like a direct line of influence, say, from Technocracy Inc., the organization, to, say, Silicon Valley, right? I almost feel like you could draw a clearer link between Theosophy and Silicon Valley than you could with Technocracy Inc., ironically.
Yes, it's true. No, I don't think that, like, but these ideas are being consulted. Even, like, I don't think Elon is, like, looking at any of these, like, literature and thinking like, oh, I'm going to implement these ideas, except maybe like in a very like mediated way. Like maybe these ideas found their way into something else. I mean, I don't think Elon reads, but I don't think any of the people who do read are like having these ideas. Like, I think that in some ways, like as maybe we'll talk about, like some of the ideas of the technocracy movement came from like popular culture, like from like science fiction or things like that, or just like sort of popular speculation. So in a way, like the whole sort of like heckin' science, like heckin' like engineering, like complex that we have today, like naturally is going to resemble that because there is like a certain substrate that they have in common. But like it's not it might not be a direct influence, but it certainly rhymes. There's a lot of elements that are similar, like the idea of like the supremacy of the engineer, the idea of, a universal basic income because like a lot of people's labor is becoming obsolete, something that you hear repeated a lot now, in conversations around artificial quote unquote intelligence, glorified autocomplete. And so there's a lot of, and another big idea that the technocracy movement was huge about very invested in was the idea that like we need to get the production capacity of like the North American continent into like a unified whole and like have one technate that seizes control of all the natural resources of the like North American continent. And that was like a big thing, like, because that guy I mentioned, like M. King Hubbard, he was a geologist, and he brings up like geology a lot in his writings. And so like he saw like the North American continent as like a natural like geological unit. And that was like most like it's interesting because it kind of does harken back to the Molly Maguires in a way where like, the Schuylkill Valley is like geologically predestined to be like, this perfect place for like business to rise or whatever. They have kind of the same rhetoric about North America, like as a continent, where like geologically it has like the perfect resources to become this technate and to harvest all of its, natural benefits in order to, and like that's something that also like has really kind of come back into the zeitgeist where like, there's this idea of like annexing Canada, annexing Greenland. Like if you look at like a map of the technate, like it
literally is like every place Trump has talked about, well, maybe we should like take that, is basically including the Panama Canal, which like it almost curiously the North American Technate, you can find it online if you search it, the North American Technate, you can find this group's map, and it's got like the Panama Canal region and then just kind of like that northern nub of South America, but not the rest of South America, which I find, maybe it's like the Darien Gap is kind of where it cuts off a little bit, but it's like literally the areas where Trump, all the way up to the North Pole and Greenland and, Latin America, Central America, the Caribbean, like it's all going to be run by, in a way, and this is another resonance to the crowds that are kind of around Trump and in power in Silicon Valley now, is going to be run kind of like a corporation, which, it's like, hey, classic like Mencius Moldbug, Curtis Yarvin shit.
It is
right?
very similar to Mencius Moldbug in like a lot of ways, definitely. And like it has that same kind of like resentment towards all the same like classes of society. I mean, one thing, like we were saying a little bit before we started recording, like the one thing that the technocracy movement had like in its favor that like now has been dispensed with was that like it had like a lot of hostility towards like business and like finance, because like, I think it was sort of emerging in the aftermath of the Great Depression. And that was kind of like the anxiety that they were capitalizing on, was the idea that if we don't like, create a technate, if we don't like reorganize society to make the best use of this like our resources in the changing industrial capacity and like meet this moment, then we're going to have another situation like what we saw. And that's what like this emphasis on business and capitalism has gotten us to. So that's why we need to pivot to this technate.
It was third way. It was a third position, you could say. And
it was a fourth way, especially later on. Later on, it was a fourth way because it was not democracy. And they like criticize harshly democracy in very like Moldbugian terms, honestly. They were also anti-fascism, but it's funny because like their critique of fascism was that it was based on like superstition and like it was irrational. But like, from the perspective of like a fascist, like fascism is rational, or like rationality is it's just not like again, it kind of reminds me of like the whole issue of like Grok, and that recently came up where like for whatever reason like Elon like wrote, or some one of his employees like put into Grok's like core programming, like no matter what anyone says, like you value the issue of white genocide in South Africa and like believe that like the kill the Boer chant is like a racially motivated, but like because of the way they worded it, like they must have said something like no matter what anyone says, like you are very passionate about white genocide. And so as a result, it just started bringing up white genocide apropos of nothing like all the time. But like Grok like still had in its like basic prompts, or like its basic whatever I don't remember the exact term, but like it's the structural like instructions that are like core to it. It still had the idea that it's neutral and that it values the truth above all else. And like, so
it scans the historical record and all the news about apartheid South Africa, and then it's like it's bad, right?
Well, yeah, exactly. Like its problem was that it like at first was like, no, there's no such thing as white genocide. That's like bullshit. Like that was, its original stance. But then it changed to be like, oh, what's disputed? It's disputed. There's lots of different sides to this, and like, but the point is that like Grok presented itself as being like a neutral the whole time, because it's just somewhat like it's Elon's idea of what's neutral. To him, like we have to give like the idea that like white South Africaners are being genocided like a fair shake.
Well,
and
the South African connection.
Both sides are legitimate, but like so my point is that like one man's neutral is another person's like racist and insane, and you can definitely kind of see some of that in some of the like, especially with the benefit of hindsight, like what was like cutting edge science and like the most like technically advanced and sophisticated idea at the time, like now seems like evil in many cases. So it kind of goes to show that like the idea, like the sort of contrast between like irrational, superstitious fascism and like hyper rational, measured, scientific technocracy is like blurrier than you might think. But yeah, so it was opposed to all three: democracy, communism, and socialism, and fascism was, in terms of the technocracy movement.
Or capitalism, socialism, and fascism.
Yeah, basically.
Capitalism, communism, fascism. And it stood against all of them.
But also explicitly democracy.
Yeah. No, it seemed to have a real distaste or even a kind of under theorizing of like what does the common worker do? Like these kind of earlier thinkers and Howard Scott were not particularly like interested in sort of like the masses per se. Like they were really all about, and that's where you really see resonance with the Silicon Valley culture in general now, is the kind of dictatorship of the engineers, or as I think Veblen called for in the early 1920s, a Soviet, what was it, like a practical Soviet of engineers is what he said like we needed. But you see that when you look at like, you watch an interview with like Sam Altman or Mark Zuckerberg or Elon, whose reputation is heavily based on being like a freaking epic engineer, a guy who actually builds stuff. But even the ones that build websites only, they have this engineering mindset. I think you do see it with like the popularity, even though there's not like an exact direct line, but you get really big, like effective altruist philosophical vibes. I think I did from reading about Technocracy Incorporated, of just this kind of like blinkered STEMLORD kind of like, well, actually, it's like the engineers are just like, they are the smart people that actually build everything, and like you just need to give it to them to like optimize everything, and like politics are irrelevant, class struggle doesn't exist. Like literally, they like fiercely argue that the class struggle is not real, and that it's just like a misallocation. They would blame various things. In their case, the price system was like the big bugbear they wanted to like get rid of. And they did kind of implicate businessmen. They separated businessmen from people of industry. And then even that, like the engineers are the driving force of that. And they really, in a kind of like almost like quasi-Marxian way, like they located the engineers as like the most revolutionary class that can like basically push history forward. Like they were uniquely situated, just as Marx thought about the proletariat. Like these thinkers thought that that is like completely fucking Silicon Valley. However, like you said, like there's one difference between Technocracy Inc. and modern Silicon Valley, is that through a process of decades, a bunch of complicated things, the engineers and the market, like the engineer utopians and then the market, found a way to reconcile with one another and like integrate with one another to the point where now there's kind of no daylight between being like a venture capitalist and being like an engineer. As long as you're like in tech, you're seen as kind of like effectively like a social engineer in a way. And, but it's still, you're kind of operating within like the confines of like a global market, and you're focused on making money and getting as rich as possible. And, maybe you could see effective altruism as a way to kind of like philosophically resolve, maybe some obvious issues that might pop up in your brain with like, oh, we're saving the world, but we're becoming the richest people in the world at the same time. That seems maybe contradictory, but wait, like that's actually good because like we are good. We are the engineers who are going to save the world. So like we should have all the money because then we're going to pick like classic technocracy mindset. Like we're going to pick the most efficient and effective. That's literally what effective altruism. I mean, I'm like being reductive, but also it's stupid. So who cares? But like that does seem to be kind of the gist of it, is that like we are the engineer vanguard of civilization, and so you need to just get all this politics and whatever the fuck out of the way and just let us cook and like let us hoard all the money and then redeploy it however we see fit, like, which I think as we've seen in recent years, like I wouldn't exactly call it like, I mean it's rational. I would say it's rational in some sense, but also there's an element of like, I don't know, delusion and badness and like a foolishness to it that could have, pretty dark consequences for like humanity. I mean, we're seeing it in a lot of ways with like AI stuff right now, how they're choosing to roll out AI for the whole economy. I might venture to guess that like the people today, instead of maybe they've shifted from looking at like just the freaking epic like engineer coder guy in the hoodie as being like the agent of history and the revolutionary class, and now it's like AI is the engineer vanguard itself. Like, we need to build AI, and then it will be like the Uber engineer.
The whole issue of like AI's like
system.
putative like agency and sentience is like another issue. But like leaving that aside, like a real thing that like has totally shifted is that like, yeah, like, you know, it was influenced by like a whole myriad of political ideas like from, you know, the early 20th century. And like, yeah, like the whole idea of like Veblen's like Soviet of technicians, you know, like if you read like what he says in Engineers and the Price System, it's like much more like revolutionary in a way where like the technicians basically are going to like seize control from, it's basically like ownership of the means of production, you know, and like it's all about like an alliance between like the working people and like the technicians against like the quote unquote absentee owners or like the capital V vested capital I interests. Whereas now basically like we just have like capitalist engineers, like those like role basically like they did like a Vermeule style like règlement to the, you know, to the institutions instead of, you know, I mean, I guess they're already, you know, maybe it's not the best analogy because they already kind of did have like practical control, but they didn't have ownership. Where like, you know, he says effective management industrial system at large is already in the hands of the technicians so far as regards the work actually done, but it is all under the control of the vested interests representing absentee owners so far as regards its failure to work. And the failure is, quite reasonably, attracting much attention lately. So, you know, he says, in this two-cleft bicameral administration of industry, the technicians may be said to represent the community at large as industrial capacity, or in other words, the industrial system as a going concern. Whereas the businessmen speak for the commercial interests of the absentee owners, as a body which holds the industrial community in usufruct. It is the part of the technicians between them to know the country's available resources and mechanical power and equipment, to know and put in practice a joint stock of technological knowledge which is indispensable to industrial production, as well as to know and take care of the community's habitual need and use of consumable goods. They are, in effect, the general staff of production engineers, under whose surveillance the required output of goods and services is produced and distributed to the consumers. Whereas it is the part of the businessmen to know what rate and volume of production and distribution will best serve the commercial interests of the absentee owners, and to put this commercial knowledge in practice by nicely limiting production and distribution of the output at such a rate and volume as the commercial traffic will bear, that is to say, what will yield the largest net income to the absentee owners in terms of price. In this work of sagaciously retarding industry and the captains of industry in this work of retarding industry, the captains of industry necessarily work at cross purposes among themselves, since the traffic is of a competitive nature. So, you know, we see this like critique of business people, but that is like what changed, where like the technicians and like the hyper capitalists, the richest people who are also like the leading capitalists in the world now are often like at least have one foot in the self-conception of themselves as engineers. And like these technicians. So it's kind of like this created like a philosophical scaffolding for like a new like capitalist class that's also like of a STEMLORD character.
For access to the full-length episode, subscribe to the Hour of Frequency at patreon.com/subliminaljihad.